Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we've helped the longest. Have you ever wondered what happens when unconditional family love meets calculated manipulation? What happens when the very generosity that flows from your heart becomes the weapon used against you? This is the story of how I discovered that my brother had been using my financial support not to build his family's future, but to fund a secret gambling addiction while his wife and children went without. It's a story about boundaries, betrayal, and the heartbreaking moment when you realize that saying no to family might be the most loving thing you can do. My name is David, and for nearly 8 years, I had been the financial safety net for my younger brother Marcus and his family. I'm 34 now, working as a software engineer in Portland, Oregon, and I had always prided myself on being the responsible older brother. Marcus is 32, 2 years younger than me, and from the outside, our relationship looked like the perfect example of family loyalty. When he struggled, I stepped in. When his children needed something, Uncle David made sure they had it. When Sarah, his wife, looked stressed about bills, I quietly transferred money to help ease their burden. I thought I was being a good brother, a good uncle, and a good man. But as I sat in my driveway that cold December evening in 2023, staring at bags of Christmas presents that would never be opened by the family I'd bought them for, I realized I had been something else entirely. I had been an enabler, a victim, and most painfully of all, a fool. The text message on my phone was short and brutal, sent by my own mother just an hour before I was supposed to arrive for Christmas dinner at my parents' house in suburban Seattle. David, we've decided it would be better if you didn't come tonight. Marcus feels you haven't been supportive enough lately, and we don't want any tension during the holidays. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with that text message. It starts 8 years earlier when Marcus first asked me for help, and I said yes without question. He had just gotten married to Sarah, a sweet, quiet woman from Spokane who worked part-time at a local daycare center. Marcus was between jobs again, something that happened more often than anyone in our family wanted to admit. He had a pattern of starting strong at new companies, getting overwhelmed when the work became challenging, and then finding reasons to quit or getting himself fired. Our parents, Linda and Robert, had helped him through college in his early 20s, but by his late 20s, they were getting tired of the constant financial crises. That's when I stepped in. I was 26, fresh out of graduate school with a computer science degree, and I had just landed my first serious job at a tech company in Portland. The salary felt enormous to me then, more money than I had ever imagined having, and when Marcus called me crying because he and Sarah were about to be evicted from their apartment, it felt natural to help. After all, what's family for if not to catch each other when we fall? Transferred $800 to cover their rent, and Marcus promised it would be a one-time thing, that he just needed to get back on his feet. But one time became two-time, and two-time became a pattern that would define our relationship for the next 8 years. Marcus would call with increasingly dramatic stories about financial emergencies, and I would respond with increasingly larger amounts of money. When Sarah got pregnant with their first child, Emma, I helped with medical bills. When Emma was born and they needed a larger apartment, I covered the security deposit and first month's rent. When Marcus finally found a stable job at a warehouse in Tacoma, but the pay was lower than expected, I quietly supplemented their income for months until he adjusted to the new budget. The requests became more frequent and more urgent. Marcus developed a talent for timing his calls perfectly, usually late at night when I was tired and emotionally vulnerable, or right before major holidays when the thought of his children going without made my chest tight with anxiety. He would start with small talk, asking about my work or my dating life, making me feel connected and cared for. Then would come the pivot, always delivered with just the right amount of shame and desperation. I hate asking you this, David, but Emma needs new school clothes and Sarah's car just broke down, and I don't know who else to turn to. You know I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. What made it even more effective was that Marcus was genuinely good at making his requests seem reasonable. He never asked for luxury items or obviously frivolous purchases. It was always necessities, rent, groceries, medical bills, car repairs, school supplies, children's clothing. How do you say no when your brother tells you his 3-year-old needs winter coats? How do you refuse when he explains that Sarah is working extra shifts at the daycare, but they still can't make ends meet? How do you turn away when he tells you that little Emma asked why other kids have new backpacks for school, but she has to use the torn one from last year? Over time, the amounts grew larger and the stories became more elaborate. What started as occasional $300 emergency loans became monthly $1,000 transfers. Marcus developed a sophisticated understanding of my psychology. learning exactly which emotional buttons to push and when. He knew I felt guilty about my financial success while his family struggled. He knew I had a soft spot for his children, particularly Emma, who always ran to hug me whenever I visited. He knew that our parents constantly praised me for being so generous with family, and that this praise fed a part of my identity I cherished. But Marcus was also clever about maintaining plausible deniability. He never explicitly said that my financial support was expected or owed. Instead, he would paint vivid pictures of his family's struggles and then step back, letting me draw the obvious conclusion that I should help. When I offered money, he would initially protest, claiming he couldn't possibly accept such generosity before reluctantly agreeing with heartfelt gratitude. This dance made me feel like the assistance was my idea, my choice, my generous gesture, rather than the result of calculated manipulation. The system worked beautifully for Marcus for almost 8 years. By 2023, I had given him and his family well over $40,000 in direct financial support, not counting the gifts, vacations, and extras I regularly provided. I had paid for Emma's summer camps, her school supplies, her birthday parties. I had covered Marcus and Sarah's anniversary dinner, their car insurance when money was tight, even their groceries during particularly difficult months. When their second child, James, was born in 2021, I bought the crib, the stroller, the car seat, and most of the nursery furniture. When Sarah wanted to go back to school to get her early childhood education certification, I paid the tuition fees and bought her textbooks. Looking back now, I can see how the dynamic gradually shifted from gratitude to entitlement, though it was so subtle that I didn't notice it happening at the time. In the early years, Marcus would send long, heartfelt text messages thanking me for my help and promising to pay me back someday. He would invite me over for dinner frequently, making sure Sarah cooked my favorite meals and that the children gave me extra hugs. He would brag about me to friends and extended family members, calling me the most generous person he knew and making sure everyone understood what a good brother I was. But as the years passed, the thank you messages became shorter and less frequent. The dinner invitations dwindled. The public praise continued, but it began to feel more performative, as if Marcus was managing his image rather than expressing genuine gratitude. More troubling was the way he began to react when I couldn't help immediately or when I asked questions about how the money would be used. What had once been humble requests became increasingly urgent demands, and any hesitation on my part was met with guilt trips about his children's welfare or passive-aggressive comments about how much money I was making compared to his family's struggles. The turning point began in November 2023, about a month before that fateful Christmas text message. Marcus called me with his usual routine, but something felt different. His story was more elaborate than usual, involving Sarah's car breaking down, unexpected medical bills, and Emma needing new winter clothes all at the same time. When I asked a few follow-up questions about the car repair, Marcus became defensive, accusing me of not trusting him and questioning why I needed so many details when his family was suffering. For the first time in 8 years, I told him I needed a few days to think about it rather than transferring money immediately. Marcus's reaction was swift and ugly. Within hours, I received a series of text messages that revealed a side of my brother I had never seen before. He accused me of being selfish and forgetting where I came from. He reminded me that I had no wife or children of my own to support, implying that this somehow obligated me to support his family instead. Most hurtfully, he suggested that my reluctance to help was evidence that I didn't really love Emma and James, that I was willing to let innocent children suffer because I wanted to hoard my money for myself. But what really opened my eyes was a conversation I had with my parents that same week. When I mentioned that Marcus seemed increasingly demanding about financial help, I expected them to sympathize with my position or at least acknowledge the generosity I had shown over the years. Instead, my mother, Linda, surprised me by agreeing with Marcus. Marcus, you've set such a high bar for success, and I think it's admirable that you've been willing to help your family when you can. That's what family is for. Marcus doesn't ask for much, and it's not like you can't afford it. I think it would be good for you to remember that not everyone has been as fortunate as you have been. What shocked me most about this conversation was the underlying assumption that my financial support for Marcus's family was not a generous choice, but an obligation based on my relative financial success. My parents seemed to view my money as a family resource that should be shared rather than as the result of my own hard work and careful planning. They saw Marcus's financial struggles as partly my responsibility to solve, not because I had caused them, but because I was capable of solving them. This conversation forced me to examine my own motivations more honestly than I had ever done before. How much of my generosity was truly altruistic, and how much was driven by my need to feel needed, important, and appreciated? How much was about genuinely helping Marcus's family, and how much was about maintaining my image as the successful, generous older brother who had his life together? I began to realize that the financial support had created a codependent relationship where Marcus got money and I got validation. But neither of us was growing or becoming more independent. The more I thought about it, the more I began to see patterns that had been invisible to me before. Marcus never seemed to learn from his financial mistakes or develop better budgeting skills because he knew I would always be there to bail him out. Sarah, who I had always thought was simply quiet and shy, rarely engaged with me directly about their financial struggles, always leaving Marcus to handle the conversations and requests. My parents consistently praised my generosity while simultaneously making it clear that they expected it to continue indefinitely. Most troubling of all was what I started to notice about Emma and James during my visits to their home. While they were always excited to see Uncle David and loved the gifts I brought, they also seemed oddly anxious around their father when money was discussed. Emma, who was 8 years old by this time, had developed a habit of asking me directly if I could buy her things, rather than asking her parents first. James, only 2 years old, was too young to understand the family dynamics, but I noticed that Sarah often seemed tense and distracted during my visits, as if she was walking on eggshells around some topic that couldn't be openly discussed. These observations led me to start asking myself uncomfortable questions about what my financial assistance was really accomplishing. Was I helping Marcus's family build a stable future, or was I enabling a pattern of dependency that prevented them from developing their own financial resilience? Was my support truly helping the children, or was it teaching them that financial problems could always be solved by finding the right person to ask for money? Was I strengthening family bonds through my generosity, or was I inadvertently creating a transactional relationship where my value was measured primarily by my ability to provide financial assistance? The Christmas incident that finally opened my eyes to the full extent of the problem began 3 weeks before the holiday. Marcus called with an urgent request for $1,500 to cover Christmas gifts and a few bills that had come due unexpectedly. This was a larger amount than usual, and when I asked for more details about why the need was so urgent, Marcus became evasive. He explained that Sarah had been hoping to make Christmas special for the kids this year, but her hours had been cut at the daycare and they were behind on several payments. When I suggested that perhaps they could have a simpler Christmas and focus on being together rather than expensive gifts, Marcus exploded. "That's easy for you to say," he shouted into the phone. "You don't have kids depending on you. You don't understand what it's like to see disappointment in your child's eyes when they don't get what they asked Santa for. We're not asking for luxury items here, David. We're talking about basic Christmas presents for 2 young children. Are you really going to be the reason Emma and James have a miserable Christmas?" This conversation marked the first time Marcus had been openly hostile with me about a financial request. In the past, even when he was persistent or used guilt tactics, he maintained a veneer of respect and gratitude. This time, he was essentially demanding the money and treating my questions as unreasonable obstacles rather than legitimate concerns. When I told him I needed some time to think about it, he hung up on me without another word. Over the next few days, I found myself reflecting more deeply on the entire 8-year pattern of financial support. I started keeping a rough tally of how much money I had given Marcus's family over the years, and the number was staggering. But more important than the dollar amount was the realization that despite all this assistance, Marcus's financial situation never seemed to improve. If anything, his requests for help had become more frequent and more urgent over time, suggesting that my support was not helping him become more financially stable, but was instead enabling him to avoid addressing the underlying causes of his ongoing money problems. I decided to do something I had never done before. I said no. When Marcus called back a few days later, I told him that while I loved him and his family, I would not be providing the $1,500 for Christmas. I explained that I was concerned about the pattern of dependency that had developed and that I thought it would be better for everyone if his family found ways to manage their finances without my constant intervention. I offered to help them create a budget or find financial counseling resources, but I made it clear that the days of automatic financial bailouts were over. Marcus's reaction was swift and vicious. He accused me of abandoning my family when they needed me most. He told me that I had changed since getting my promotion at work, that success had made me selfish and cold. He said that Sarah was devastated by my refusal and that Emma had been crying because she was afraid Santa wouldn't come to their house this year. Most painfully, he told me that our parents were disappointed in me and had been talking about how I had lost touch with what was really important in life. But the conversation that really shattered my understanding of the family dynamics came when Sarah called me the next day. This was unusual because Sarah almost never contacted me directly. All financial discussions had always gone through Marcus. When I answered the phone, she was crying so hard I could barely understand her words. Between sobs, she told me that she was grateful for all the help I'd given their family over the years, but that she was also confused about why I was suddenly cutting off support right before Christmas. What Sarah said next changed everything. David, I don't understand why you're upset about the $1,500. Marcus told me you had already agreed to send it, and he's already spent most of it. I thought the Christmas money was in addition to the regular monthly help you've been providing. Marcus said you were planning to send extra this month because of the holidays. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. Sarah, I said carefully, what regular monthly help are you talking about? I haven't sent Marcus money every month. I help when there are specific emergencies, but there's no regular monthly payment. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long that I thought the call had dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was small and confused. But Marcus told me that you send money every month to help with our basic expenses. He said you set up some kind of automatic transfer because you wanted to make sure Emma and James always had what they needed. He said it was your idea because you felt guilty about being single and having more money than our family. My heart was racing as I realized what Sarah was telling me. Sarah, I need you to be very specific about this. How much money does Marcus say comes from me every month, and what does he tell you it's for? What Sarah told me in the next 10 minutes destroyed my understanding of my brother and my family situation completely. According to Sarah, Marcus had been telling her for over 2 years that I had set up a monthly transfer of $1,200 to help with their living expenses. He had explained that this was in addition to any emergency assistance I provided and that it was my way of contributing to his children's upbringing since I didn't have children of my own. Sarah had been budgeting around this supposed monthly income, believing that a significant portion of their household expenses were being covered by my ongoing generosity. But I had never set up any monthly transfer. I had never agreed to provide regular ongoing support beyond the specific emergency requests Marcus made. The monthly assistance Sarah was describing simply did not exist, at least not for me. As we talked further, more discrepancies emerged. Sarah mentioned several occasions when Marcus had told her that I had sent money for specific purposes and the amounts and timing didn't match my records. She referenced conversations Marcus claimed to have had with me about family financial planning that had never occurred. The picture that emerged from this conversation was devastating. Marcus had been lying to both of us about the money. He had been telling Sarah that I was providing much more financial support than I actually was, while telling me that their financial needs were much more urgent and specific than they actually were. Somewhere in the middle of these lies was the reality of what was happening to the money I had actually been sending, and that reality was something neither Sarah nor I had been seeing clearly. When I asked Sarah about their actual financial situation, stripping away Marcus's stories about my supposed contributions, the truth was both simpler and more disturbing than I had realized. Marcus did have a steady job at the warehouse, and Sarah did work part-time at the daycare, but their combined income should have been sufficient to cover their basic living expenses. Sarah showed me their actual budget, and while it was tight, it was not the desperate situation Marcus had been describing to me in his requests for emergency assistance. More troubling was what Sarah told me about Marcus's behavior around money. She described a pattern of secrecy and control that I had never seen during my visits to their home. Marcus handled all the household finances and rarely discussed specific income or expenses with Sarah. When Sarah asked questions about their budget or tried to understand why they were always short of money despite both of their incomes, plus my occasional assistance, Marcus became defensive and accused her of not trusting him or not appreciating how hard he worked to provide for the family. Sarah also revealed something that made my stomach sink. Marcus had been gambling. She had discovered this several months earlier when she found betting receipts in his jacket pocket. But when she confronted him about it, he had convinced her that it was just occasional entertainment and that he was actually winning more than he was losing. He had shown her screenshots of online betting accounts with positive balances and explained that he was using gambling as a way to supplement their income. Sarah, who knew very little about gambling, had believed him, especially since he continued to bring home his regular paycheck and they never seemed to be completely broke. But now, with the revelation about the fictional monthly support from me, Sarah was beginning to piece together a different picture. She was starting to realize that Marcus had been using my actual financial assistance not for family expenses, as he told me, and not in addition to his regular income, as he told her, but to cover gambling losses and maintain the illusion of financial stability while his betting habits spiraled out of control. As we talked further, Sarah shared more details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of financial deception and family manipulation. Marcus had been presenting different versions of their financial reality to different people in order to extract maximum financial support while maintaining his gambling habit. He had told me that his family was constantly on the verge of financial crisis, requiring emergency assistance for basic necessities. He had told Sarah that I was proactively providing substantial ongoing support because of my family loyalty and my desire to help raise his children. He had told our parents that he was working hard but facing economic challenges beyond his control, and that my assistance was helping his family maintain dignity during a difficult period. None of these stories was completely true, but none was completely false either, which made Marcus's deception particularly sophisticated. There were real financial pressures on his family, but they were created primarily by his gambling, rather than by economic circumstances beyond his control. He was providing financial assistance, but not to the extent he had told Sarah, and not for the reasons he had explained to our parents. Marcus was working regularly, but his income was being diverted to gambling rather than being insufficient for basic family needs. The conversation with Sarah also helped me understand why my interactions with Marcus had become increasingly tense and demanding over the past year. As his gambling habit escalated, he needed more frequent and larger amounts of money to cover his losses and maintain the various stories he had been telling to different family members. When I began asking more questions or expressing hesitation about providing assistance, I was unknowingly threatening the entire system of deception he had constructed. My resistance wasn't just inconvenient for Marcus, it was potentially catastrophic because it threatened to expose the gap between the financial reality Sarah thought they were living and the actual situation created by his gambling addiction. After my conversation with Sarah, I felt sick to my stomach for hours. The brother I thought I knew, the generous man who was struggling to provide for his family despite working hard and doing his best, simply didn't exist. In his place was someone who had been manipulating both his wife and his brother for years, using our love and concern as tools to fund a secret addiction. The grateful recipient of emergency financial assistance was actually a calculated manipulator who had been playing different family members against each other to maintain access to money for gambling. But perhaps most painful was the realization that my parents were not innocent bystanders in this situation. When I called my mother the next day to share what I had learned from Sarah, her response was not shock or sympathy, but defensive anger on Marcus's behalf. She accused me of trying to destroy my brother's family by spreading rumors and suggested that Sarah was exaggerating or misunderstanding the situation. When I tried to explain the specific discrepancies between Marcus's claims and the reality Sarah had described, my mother interrupted me. "David," she said in a tone I had never heard from her before, "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this jealous, vindictive behavior is not who you raised you to be. Marcus is under enormous stress trying to provide for his family, and instead of supporting him, you're looking for reasons to tear him down. Maybe you're upset that he has a wife and children while you're still single, but that's not his fault, and it's not fair to take it out on his family." My father's reaction was similar, though less emotionally charged. He suggested that even if Marcus had made some mistakes with money, gambling was a common way for working-class men to try to improve their family's financial situation, and it wasn't fair to judge him harshly for trying to provide better opportunities for his children. He pointed out that I had never been married or had children, so I couldn't understand the pressure Marcus was under, and that my financial success had come easily compared to the struggles Marcus faced with less education and fewer opportunities. What became clear from these conversations was that my parents had invested years in seeing me as the successful son who should share his good fortune with his less fortunate brother. They had praised my generosity not just because it helped Marcus's family, but because it confirmed their narrative about family loyalty and mutual support. My questioning of this arrangement threatened their understanding of family dynamics and their assessment of both of their sons' characters. The Christmas text message that started this story came 2 days after my conversations with Sarah and my parents. Marcus had apparently spent those 2 days building a case against me with our parents, painting my refusal to provide the $1,500 and my accusations about his financial management as evidence that I had become selfish and hostile toward his family. By the time my mother sent that text message telling me not to come to Christmas dinner, Marcus had successfully positioned himself as the victim of my unreasonable demands and painted me as the family member who was causing problems by withdrawing support during the holiday season. Sitting in my driveway that December evening, staring at the Christmas presents I had bought for a family that no longer wanted my presents, I felt a complex mix of emotions I had never experienced before. There was anger, certainly at being manipulated and lied to for so many years. There was hurt at being excluded from family Christmas for the first time in my life. There was guilt about whether I had somehow contributed to Marcus's problems by enabling his poor financial decisions. But there was also something else, something I hadn't expected: relief. For the first time in 8 years, I didn't have to worry about Marcus calling with another financial emergency. I didn't have to monitor my bank account to make sure I had enough money available for whatever crisis might emerge from his family situation. I didn't have to carefully manage conversations with my parents to make sure I was living up to their expectations for family generosity. I didn't have to pretend that Marcus's constant financial struggles were simply the result of bad luck or economic circumstances beyond his control. Over the following weeks, the full extent of the family dynamics I had been participating in became clear through a series of conversations and revelations that were both illuminating and painful. Sarah, once she understood that the monthly financial support she had been counting on didn't actually exist, began investigating their actual financial situation more thoroughly. What she discovered confirmed my worst fears about Marcus's gambling habit. Marcus had been systematically diverting money from both his paycheck and my financial assistance to online sports betting and casino gambling. Over the course of 2 years, he had lost more than $28,000, an amount that exceeded the total of my actual financial assistance during that same period. He had been using my emergency funds not to cover legitimate family expenses, but to chase gambling losses, constantly betting larger amounts in hopes of recovering previous losses and returning the diverted family money before Sarah noticed it was missing. The system had worked for a while because Marcus's gambling was producing occasional significant wins that allowed him to temporarily cover his losses and maintain the illusion of financial stability. But as his addiction progressed, the losses became larger and more frequent, requiring him to seek financial assistance more aggressively and to construct increasingly elaborate stories about family financial needs. This revelation was particularly painful for me because I realized that my emotional attachment to Emma and James had been weaponized against me. Marcus, the image, when Sarah, rather than according, he claimed most, he argued, even when this risk, the family, when Sarah, according, she argued, my father, he argued, he suggested, what made, was my, but as I reflected more deeply on these questions, I began to realize that my parents' arguments were based on the same fundamental misconception that had enabled Marcus's manipulation for so many years: the assumption that financial problems in his family were primarily my responsibility to solve rather than his responsibility to prevent. Even after learning about Marcus's gambling addiction and systematic deception, my parents continued to view my financial assistance as a family obligation rather than as a generous choice that Marcus had abused through dishonesty and manipulation. This realization helped me understand that establishing boundaries around financial assistance was not just about protecting myself from further manipulation, but was also about forcing Marcus to confront the real consequences of his gambling addiction and financial irresponsibility. As long as family members were willing to provide financial bailouts, Marcus had no incentive to address his gambling habit or develop honest financial management skills. My continued assistance, even if directed towards Sarah and the children, would simply enable Marcus to maintain his destructive patterns while shifting the burden of their consequences onto other family members. The conversation that finally clarified my thinking about the entire situation came through an unexpected source: Sarah's sister Rachel, who had been largely outside of our family dynamics, but who had become involved when Sarah and the children moved in with her. Rachel called me about a month after Christmas to thank me for helping Sarah understand the reality of her financial situation and to share her perspective on what she had observed about Marcus's behavior over the years. According to Rachel, Marcus's manipulation and sense of entitlement were not new behaviors that had emerged as his gambling addiction developed, but were instead long-standing character traits that had been enabled and reinforced by family members who were unwilling to hold him accountable for his choices. She described instances going back to Marcus's teenage years where he had used emotional manipulation, selective storytelling, and victim narratives to avoid consequences for irresponsible behavior, while positioning himself as deserving of special assistance and consideration. Rachel also shared her observations about how Marcus interacted with Sarah and the children when he thought no one outside the immediate family was watching. While he maintained a public image of being a devoted husband and father who was struggling against difficult circumstances, Rachel had noticed patterns of emotional control and financial secrecy that suggested Marcus prioritized his own needs and desires over his family's welfare, even when gambling was not involved. Most importantly, Rachel helped me understand that my financial assistance, while well intentioned, had been inadvertently enabling Marcus's manipulation not just of me, but of his entire family. By providing regular financial bailouts, I had allowed Marcus to maintain the illusion that his financial management was adequate while avoiding the natural consequences of his poor decisions. This had prevented Sarah from understanding the true extent of their financial problems and had shielded Marcus from the pressure that might have motivated him to address his gambling addiction or develop more responsible financial habits. Rachel's perspective helped me see that continuing to provide financial assistance, even with better oversight or different conditions, would not solve the underlying problems in Marcus's character and behavior. Instead, it would simply teach him to be more sophisticated in his manipulation while maintaining the family dynamics that enabled his irresponsibility. The most helpful thing I could do for Marcus, Sarah, and the children was to establish clear boundaries that forced Marcus to confront the real consequences of his choices without the safety net of family financial assistance. This understanding gave me the clarity and confidence I needed to have a final conversation with Marcus, one that would establish permanent boundaries around financial assistance and make clear that our relationship would need to be rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect rather than financial dependency and manipulation. When I called Marcus in late January, I had a clear sense of what I needed to say and what boundaries I needed to establish. Marcus's response to my call was initially defensive and hostile, consistent with the pattern of behavior he had shown throughout the crisis. He accused me of destroying his family by spreading lies about his gambling and by turning Sarah against him through financial manipulation. He argued that my sudden withdrawal of support had created the family crisis rather than simply revealing problems that already existed. And he demanded that I resume providing assistance to help his family recover from the damage my actions had caused. But when I calmly explained that I knew about the extent of his gambling losses and the systematic deception he had used to conceal them, Marcus's tone shifted from hostility to desperation. He began making the same arguments he had used for years to justify his financial requests, but now they sounded hollow and transparent in a way they had never sounded before. His claims about working hard to provide for his family rang false when I knew about his attendance problems at work. His descriptions of unexpected financial emergencies sounded manipulative when I understood they were often created by gambling losses. His emotional appeals about his children's welfare felt calculated when I realized how often he had exaggerated or fabricated their needs. What became clear during this conversation was that Marcus had never really seen me as a brother who was choosing to help his family out of love and concern. Instead, he had seen me as a financial resource that he was entitled to access whenever his own poor decisions created consequences he didn't want to face. My questions about how money would be used weren't reasonable requests for accountability, but unreasonable obstacles to his access to funding. My hesitation about providing assistance wasn't thoughtful consideration of what would be most helpful for his family, but selfish resistance to my family obligations. This understanding helped me realize that rebuilding a healthy relationship with Marcus would require him to fundamentally change his perspective on family financial responsibility and his own accountability for his choices. As long as he continued to view my financial support as an entitlement rather than a gift, and as long as he continued to blame others for the consequences of his gambling addiction, no amount of assistance from me would help his family achieve genuine financial stability or repair the trust that had been broken through years of deception. I ended the conversation by clearly stating the boundaries I was establishing going forward. Would not provide any financial assistance to Marcus or his family unless and until he acknowledged his gambling addiction, sought professional treatment, and demonstrated a sustained commitment to honest financial management over a significant period of time. I would not discuss family financial matters with our parents or other relatives, as these conversations had been used to create pressure and guilt that enabled Marcus's manipulation. I would be willing to rebuild our relationship as brothers, but only on the foundation of honesty, mutual respect, and personal responsibility, rather than financial dependency and obligation. Marcus's response to these boundaries was predictably angry and accusatory. He accused me of abandoning my family when they needed me most, of being heartless toward innocent children, and of using my financial success as a weapon to control other family members. He predicted that I would regret my decision when I realized how much damage I had caused to family relationships. and he suggested that my selfishness would ultimately leave me isolated and alone while his family recovered and moved forward without my negative influence. But underneath Marcus's anger, I could hear something else: fear. For the first time in 8 years, he was facing the prospect of managing his family's finances without the safety net of my financial assistance. He would need to confront his gambling addiction because he could no longer cover losses with emergency funds from me. He would need to be honest with Sarah about their financial situation because he could no longer maintain illusions about external support. He would need to develop genuine financial management skills because he could no longer rely on family bailouts to compensate for poor decisions. The months that followed were difficult for everyone involved, but they also brought clarity and positive change that would not have been possible if I'd continued enabling Marcus's irresponsible behavior. Sarah, with the support of her sister and access to financial counseling resources, began rebuilding her family's financial stability based on realistic budgeting and honest assessment of their income and expenses. She also began the process of deciding whether her marriage could be salvaged if Marcus was willing to address his gambling addiction and commit to honest communication about family finances. Marcus initially continued his pattern of blaming others for his problems and seeking alternative sources of financial assistance rather than addressing the underlying issues in his behavior. He attempted to borrow money from friends, extended family members, and even online lenders, often using the same emotional manipulation tactics he had perfected with me over the years. But without the reliable safety net of my financial support, these strategies proved unsustainable, and Marcus was eventually forced to confront the reality of his gambling addiction and its impact on his family. The turning point for Marcus came when Sarah filed for legal separation and established formal custody arrangements that required him to demonstrate financial stability and complete gambling addiction treatment before he could have unsupervised time with Emma and James. Faced with the prospect of losing regular contact with his children, Marcus finally acknowledged that his gambling had created serious problems and agreed to enter a residential treatment program for gambling addiction. My parents' response to these developments evolved slowly and painfully over the course of several months. Initially, they continued to blame me for the family crisis and to pressure me to resume financial assistance to help Marcus and Sarah reconcile. But as more details emerged about the extent of Marcus's gambling losses and financial deception, they began to acknowledge that the problems in his family were not simply the result of economic hardship or my withdrawal of support. The conversation that finally shifted my parents' perspective came when Sarah shared with them the detailed financial records she had compiled, showing how Marcus had been diverting both his paycheck and my financial assistance to gambling while lying to everyone about the family's actual financial situation. Seeing the specific amounts and dates of Marcus's gambling losses, compared with the timing and amounts of my financial assistance, made it impossible for my parents to maintain their narrative that Marcus had been a victim of circumstances beyond his control. More importantly, Sarah helped my parents understand how my continued financial assistance would have prevented Marcus from confronting his gambling addiction and would have enabled him to continue lying to his family about their financial reality. She explained that while the loss of my support had created immediate financial stress, it had also forced Marcus to face the consequences of his choices in a way that ultimately led him to seek treatment and begin taking responsibility for his behavior. The gradual recognition that I had been trying to protect the family rather than harm it allowed my parents to begin rebuilding their relationship with me. Though this process required them to acknowledge how their pressure and expectations had contributed to the manipulation I had experienced for so many years. They needed to understand that their view of my financial success as a family resource, rather than a personal achievement, had enabled Marcus's sense of entitlement and had made it emotionally difficult for me to establish reasonable boundaries around financial assistance. As I write this story now, almost a year after that devastating Christmas text message, the family dynamics have changed in ways that are healthier for everyone involved. Though the process of rebuilding trust and establishing new patterns of interaction continues to be challenging, Marcus completed his gambling addiction treatment and has been working with a financial counselor to develop honest budgeting skills and rebuild his family's financial stability without external assistance. He has also been attending family therapy with Sarah to address the deeper issues of honesty and communication that contributed to their marital problems. Sarah and the children have moved back in with Marcus, but with clear agreements about financial transparency and accountability that include regular meetings with their financial counselor and full access to all bank accounts and financial records. Sarah has also increased her work hours and is pursuing additional education that will allow her to achieve greater financial independence, reducing the family's vulnerability to future financial crises. Most importantly for me, I have been able to rebuild relationships with all family members based on mutual respect and honest communication rather than financial dependency and obligation. My relationship with Marcus is still fragile and requires ongoing work to rebuild trust. But it is no longer based on his expectation that I will provide financial assistance whenever he faces difficulties. My relationship with Emma and James has actually become stronger and more genuine now that I can interact with them as their uncle who loves them rather than as a financial resource they need to access through their father. The experience has taught me important lessons about the difference between helping and enabling, about the importance of establishing boundaries even with family members, and about the ways that financial assistance can become a form of control and manipulation if it is not grounded in honesty and accountability. I learned that my desire to be seen as generous and supportive had made me vulnerable to manipulation and had prevented me from asking the tough questions that might have revealed Marcus's problems earlier. I also learned that family loyalty does not require accepting dishonesty or enabling destructive behavior, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to allow them to face the natural consequences of their choices rather than shielding them from difficulty. The financial assistance I had been providing to Marcus was not actually helping his family build a stable future. Instead, it was enabling him to avoid developing the skills and accountability necessary for genuine financial independence. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that my worth as a brother, son, and family member was not measured by my willingness to provide financial assistance, but by my commitment to honest relationships based on mutual respect and care. The family members who truly cared about me supported my decision to establish boundaries, even when those boundaries created temporary difficulties. The family members who valued me primarily as a source of financial assistance revealed their priorities through their response to my refusal to continue enabling destructive behavior. Looking back on this experience, I feel grateful for the painful lessons it taught me, even though I wish the learning process had been less emotionally devastating. The Christmas text message that excluded me from family dinner was one of the most hurtful communications I have ever received, but it also marked the beginning of my liberation from a family dynamic that was unhealthy for everyone involved. Being forced to confront the reality of Marcus's manipulation and my own enabling behavior was difficult, but it ultimately led to more authentic relationships and better outcomes for his family. If you are reading this story and recognizing similar patterns in your own family relationships, I want you to know that establishing boundaries around financial assistance does not make you selfish or disloyal. Asking questions about how money will be used does not mean you don't trust or care about family members. Requiring accountability and honesty does not mean you are trying to control or manipulate others. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to stop enabling destructive behavior and force the people you care about to develop the skills and responsibility necessary for genuine independence and health. The journey from financial enabler to supportive brother has been difficult, but it has ultimately led to relationships that are stronger, more honest, and more sustainable than the ones that were based on financial dependency and manipulation. My family learned that love and loyalty do not require sacrificing your own financial security or accepting dishonesty about important matters. We learned that genuine help sometimes looks like refusing to provide assistance that would prevent someone from learning and growing from their mistakes. Most importantly, we learned that family relationships are strongest when they are based on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine care for each other's long-term welfare rather than on financial transactions and emotional manipulation. The 8 years I spent providing financial assistance to Marcus's family taught me valuable lessons about the difference between help and enablement. And those lessons have made me a better brother, son, and family member, even though learning them required facing some painful truths about people I love. Today, when Emma asks me for something, I can respond based on what would truly be good for her, rather than based on guilt or manipulation. When Marcus faces financial challenges, he has the skills and accountability systems necessary to address them honestly, rather than looking for someone else to solve them. When Sarah makes financial decisions for their family, she has accurate information and realistic expectations, rather than depending on external assistance that may or may not be available. These changes have made our family relationships more authentic, more sustainable, and ultimately more loving than they were during the years when financial assistance was creating artificial dependencies and enabling dishonest behavior. The pain of establishing boundaries was temporary, but the benefits of honest relationships based on mutual respect and personal responsibility will last for the rest of our lives.